Almost everything you've been taught about the mechanics of good writing is fundamentally dangerously wrong.
Oh, absolutely. It's a total misconception.
Right, because we are conditioned from childhood to believe that writing is primarily an act of self-expression. You have a feeling, a thesis, a vision, and your goal is to just sort of transpose that internal state onto a page.
Which is the exact starting point of all bad communication.
Exactly. But if you analyze the communication strategies of the most powerful entities on the planet, billion-dollar venture capital firms, geopolitical strategists, or the engineers commanding frontier artificial intelligence, you realize that the raw text itself is completely irrelevant.
It's just a delivery mechanism.
Yes, the paradigm-shifting reality we are unpacking today is that writing is not art. It is applied psychology. It's the tactical execution of a precise, calculated program inside the biological hardware of another human being.
And the stakes of understanding of this distinction, I mean, they go far beyond drafting a more effective corporate memo. We are really dissecting the mechanics of power, influence, and capital allocation in the modern global economy.
It's about who gets resources and who doesn't.
Right. Because what we are seeing, especially as we approach 2026, is that the structural forces governing human attention are essentially identical to the mathematical laws governing large language models.
Wow.
Yeah. And if you misunderstand these forces, you are effectively invisible to the systems that allocate those global resources.
So today we are taking a deep dive into a masterclass developed by tech entrepreneur Varun Maya. He frames this specific capability, the ability to engineer a targeted cognitive experience in the mind of a receiver, as the ultimate survival skill of the next decade.
It's non-negotiable at this point.
It really is. Whether you are attempting to secure capital in emerging markets, trying to force a perspective shift in a skeptical geopolitical adversary, or attempting to constrain the chaotic probability space of a trillion-parameter AI, the underlying architecture relies on the exact same framework.
It's a unified theory of influence.
Exactly. And for those of you analyzing these global trends with us, making sure you are subscribed to the feed is the best way to ensure you don't miss these long-form structural breakdowns. We are going to decode the hidden mechanics of persuasion, the biology of storytelling, and the invisible scripts that are being run on you, personally, every single time you open a digital interface.
The interconnectedness here requires a complete reassessment of how we view communication. What we will systematically uncover is that the neurobiology of the human brain, the architectural lore of massive science fiction properties, and the high-dimensional vector mathematics of artificial intelligence are all governed by identical rules.
Rules of what we could basically categorize as world building.
Right, because to influence any complex system, whether it's biological or digital, you can't just inject a new idea in a vacuum. You first have to map the fundamental physical and psychological laws of the reality that system currently inhabits.
Let's test that theory immediately by looking at the raw application of this concept. The source material argues that effective communication has almost nothing to do with the sender.
Right, the sender is merely a transmission mechanism.
The true master allocates 100% of their analytical focus to reception. And to illustrate the mechanics of this, the source brings up the fascinating case of Sompurik.
Yeah, this is a brilliant case study. For the necessary context, Sompurik was a software engineer operating within the highly competitive, venture-backed startup ecosystem.
Their Y Combinator world.
Exactly. And it was eventually discovered that he was simultaneously juggling 3 to 4 different full-time engineering roles at high-growth startups. He was deceiving multiple founders in the process.
Which is wild. But we are going to entirely bypass the debate regarding the ethics of his employment practices today.
Right, that's a different conversation.
Our focus is strictly on the methodology he deployed to infiltrate these organizations so effectively. Because when the fallout occurred and these founders inevitably compared notes, a distinct pattern emerged that is far more interesting than the deception itself.
They realized Parekh had used virtually identical cold outreach emails to get hired across the board.
And if you look at his GitHub repositories or his technical background, he wasn't some generational 10x coding prodigy.
No, he was competent but not exceptional.
But his true leverage wasn't in his ability to write Python. It was his ability to write that cold email. He didn't write an application to express who he was as an engineer. He wrote an application that surgically isolated who he was writing to.
He compiled and executed a psychological program. If we deconstruct the actual template he deployed, line by line, It functions as a masterclass in cognitive infiltration.
Let's look at the opening line.
His opening line was, "I love everything about what your company is doing." Now, the conventional surface-level analysis is that this is merely polite corporate flattery.
Right, just kissing up to the boss.
But the structural analysis reveals a highly calculated shift in power dynamics from the very first syllable.
But I have to push back here for a second. Isn't this just sophisticated pandering? I mean, if a founder is smart enough to build a 9-figure tech company, aren't they going to see right through an email that perfectly regurgitates their own ego back to them?
You would think so.
Because in an inbox flooded with people begging for jobs, just inserting the company name doesn't seem like a psychological masterstroke to me.
Well, it's not about the company name. It is about the reallocation of the spotlight. You really have to analyze the baseline psychological state of a startup founder.
Okay, set the scene for us.
They are operating in an environment of extreme uncertainty, immense financial pressure, and profound isolation. They are constantly fending off demands. Investors are demanding returns. Employees are demanding equity. Vendors are demanding payment.
Everyone wants a piece of them.
Exactly. Every email they receive is a transaction where someone immediately. But his target is the Silicon Valley ecosystem. That specific subculture operates on a mythological archetype. They fetishize the concept of the relentless, obsessive, pure code engineer who is entirely unburdened by the distractions of a balanced life.
So he's playing a character.
He is not being self-deprecating. He is holding up a mirror to the founder's most desperate organizational need and projecting the exact mythological creature the founder believes is required to achieve scale.
He's effectively telling them, I am a pure execution machine built exclusively for your vision. And he cements that with the technical dialect he chooses. He doesn't just list his coding languages. He specifically notes his preference for super lean teams and his ability to work across the stack.
That right there is the strategic deployment of in-group linguistic markers. Every subculture, every localized concentration of power has a distinct dialect. By using phrases like lean teams and across the stack, he transcends the role of an external applicant. He is signaling tribal belonging. He is communicating that he doesn't require onboarding into their worldview because he is already a native inhabitant of their constructed reality.
This highlights a massive inefficiency in how most people approach persuasion globally. People assume the target is optimizing for a logical, rubric-based decision, like a checklist.
They aren't. Not at that level.
The source material argues that in high-stakes environments, leaders are not optimizing for competence. They are optimizing for conviction. A founder surviving on blind faith doesn't want a mercenary who clocks out at 5 p.m. They require a missionary.
The structural reality of that psychological hack is profound. Consider the foundational narrative a founder must maintain just to survive the statistical improbability of startup success.
They have to be slightly delusional.
They must genuinely believe their mission is so historically significant that it naturally exerts a gravitational pull on exceptional obsessive talent. Perick's email was not a request for employment. It was empirical validation of the founder's deepest, most fragile core belief.
So he wasn't trading his labor for capital at all.
No.
The actual commodity he was trading was confirmation bias.
Precisely. He provided undeniable, localized proof to the founder that their worldview was accurate. The subtext is literally, you are a visionary, the mission is paramount, and people like me exist solely because visions like yours require us.
Wow. And when you supply an individual with absolute confirmation of their own identity and historical importance, the dynamic instantly shifts.
It ceases to be a hierarchy of a subordinate pleading with a gatekeeper. It becomes a horizontal transaction between two individuals co-inhabiting the exact same reality.
This brings us to a critical threshold for anyone listening. We understand how Perick hijacked a highly specific, pre-existing subculture, but the global economy is vast. How do you systematically map out and infiltrate the worldview of any target audience?
Right, whether you're negotiating a supply chain contract in Shenzhen or pitching a policy shift to a European regulatory board.
Exactly. How do you do that at scale?
To execute that systematically, we have to establish the architecture of belief.
Oh.
The source introduces a framework reliant on what it terms atomic units.
Atomic units.
Yes. In theoretical physics, an atom was historically considered the fundamental, indivisible building block of matter. In applied psychology, atomic units are the indivisible building blocks of a specific worldview.
So the core truths.
Every community, industry, or geopolitical faction operates on a bedrock of baseline assumptions. These are truths so deeply embedded in their collective consciousness that they are essentially invisible. They are never debated.
Give me a concrete example of an atomic unit in a standard corporate negotiation.
In a boardroom, an atomic unit is the assumption that quarterly revenue must continually expand. You don't argue about that. In the pharmaceutical sector, an atomic unit is, we must navigate FDA compliance to survive.
Right.
You cannot begin a persuasion attempt by challenging these foundations. You must initiate the sequence by demonstrating total alignment with their atomic units. You must induce a state of neurological agreement, getting them to internally nod, before you attempt to introduce any complex or disruptive variable.
Because if you introduce a variable that contradicts their atomic units, you trigger an immediate immunological response from their cognitive defenses.
They shut down entirely.
Let's ground this in the high-stakes example provided by the source regarding venture capital mathematics in emerging markets, specifically India. If you spend 10 minutes on business forums, you will see endless praise for companies that are bootstrapped and slightly profitable.
It's the internet's favorite narrative.
Right. The general public views a sustainable, say 5% profit margin as the ultimate hallmark of a successful enterprise.
And yet, if you carry that exact narrative into a Tier 1 venture capital firm and pitch a model designed to yield a small, sustainable profit, you will be swiftly dismissed.
Laughed out of the room.
Literally. And it is not because the business is fundamentally flawed. It is because you have severely violated the atomic units of their mathematical reality. A large-scale VC fund does not operate on retail economic logic.
Walk us through their math.
Okay, so a major fund might raise $1 billion. Through multiple rounds of funding and dilution, they might own, at best, 20% of a given startup. For their macroeconomic model to generate the requisite returns for their limited partners, they cannot subsist on single-digit profit dividends.
The math simply breaks.
It disintegrates entirely. They structurally require the asset to either IPO or be acquired for an enterprise value north of $1 billion. Anything less than a massive liquidity event is essentially written off as a rounding error.
So a $10 million profit is useless to them.
Completely useless. Therefore, if your communication fails to acknowledge this hyperscale necessity, you are speaking a dead language.
So, assuming you map their atomic units and understand they need that billion-dollar exit, how do you actually force them to change their investment strategy? The source talks about the frame shift.
Yes, the frame shift.
How do you take a rigid, mathematically constrained entity like a VC and successfully pivot their entire worldview?
You employ a technique of strategic zooming in and zooming out, anchoring every movement to their ground truth. You do not initiate the conversation by declaring their current model obsolete.
Because that triggers the immune system.
Exactly. You initiate through validation, phase 1. You explicitly confirm their reality. You say, we agree that the structural requirement is $1 billion liquidity event, and to achieve that scale, we agree that a ruthlessly efficient go-to-market strategy is non-negotiable.
You are feeding their atomic units back to them. They are nodding. The friction is zero.
Then phase 2 introduces a universally acknowledged friction point that already exists within their world. You say, we also recognize that traditional acquisition channels like Meta and Google Ads are reaching saturation. The customer acquisition cost, the CC, is inflating aggressively, which fundamentally threatens the profit margins required to justify a $1 billion valuation.
Again, you are entirely within their perimeter. You are articulating their own private anxieties.
And then you execute the pivot.
The frame shift.
Right. Phase 3 is the frame shift. You introduce a novel variable that perfectly resolves the anxiety you just validated. You state, there is currently an asset class operating with an effective customer acquisition cost of 0. Content creators.
Ah, I see.
You reframe the creation of a massive media presence from a vanity exercise into a hard, structural go-to-market strategy. You argue that leveraging organic content guarantees superior margins, thereby securing the high valuation multiples they structurally require.
It's a brilliant maneuver because you've taken them to an entirely new geographic location without them ever feeling like they left their living room.
Exactly.
But the source material is very clear about the fragility of this moment. You cannot just drop a theoretical frame shift and expect them to sign a check. You have to anchor the new reality.
Theoretical persuasion is highly unstable. The human brain struggles to allocate capital or belief to abstract concepts without empirical reinforcement. You must immediately ground the frame shift with undeniable, localized examples.
Give us some of those anchors.
You point to physics walla an Indian edtech firm that achieved unicorn status relying heavily on organic content and low acquisition costs. You point to global comparables, Mr. Beast's Feastables capturing massive market share in the CPG space,
Right.
or Logan Paul's Prime disrupting the beverage oligopoly.
The psychological rule here is volume and proximity. The more concrete examples you stack, the more the target's cognitive defenses are forced to accept the new reality as an established physical law.
They can't reject it if it's already happening.
And the source notes that without prior examples, forcing this shift is nearly impossible. Varun Maya himself had to wait years, relying on self-funding for his 3D gaming studio, simply because there were zero pre-existing examples of a top-tier Indian 3D game studio to point to.
Right.
He couldn't provide the anchor, so the VC immune system rejected the pitch.
He was forced to become his own case study to establish the precedent, which transitions us to a much more complex architectural challenge. We have analyzed how to infiltrate an existing world and how to gently modify one. But what is the procedure when you are forced to construct a reality entirely from scratch?
Well, the source argues that a true 0-to-1 world-building exercise is functionally impossible. You cannot invent a new vocabulary, a new physics engine, and new socio-political norms simultaneously and expect a human brain to process it.
The cognitive load is just too high.
Exactly. You always have to borrow. And the definitive case study the source provides for this is Frank Herbert's seminal science fiction work, Dune.
Dune represents the apex of structural world building, precisely because Herbert understood the necessity of cognitive anchors. He did not present a blank slate.
No, he borrowed heavily.
He intentionally hijacked deeply embedded historical and theological frameworks from our own reality to stabilize his fiction. He heavily integrated Arabic linguistic structures and Islamic theological concepts.
Like the protagonist being referred to as Modib.
Yes, a term evoking the Arabic word for educator or tutor. The underlying principles are called usul. He utilizes the concept of the lisan al-ghaib, the voice from the outer world, and the Mahdi, the prophesied redeemer.
He basically weaponized thousands of years of human religious awe and hard-coded it into his universe. When the reader encounters those concepts, even if they don't consciously speak Arabic, there is a subconscious recognition of religious weight.
They feel the gravity of a holy war before a single shot is fired.
Exactly. But borrowing the anchor is just the foundation. Once he has you secured, he introduces wildly alien concepts, but he forces them to adhere to a ruthless internal consistency. Let's look at the spice melange.
The spice is the perfect example of systemic lore. Herbert does not present the spice as a generic, unexplainable, magical mineral. He grounds it in a brutal, internally consistent biological reality. The most valuable substance in the galactic economy is quite literally the biological byproduct, the excrement of the massive sandworms indigenous to the planet Arrakis.
So the entire interstellar economy is dependent on worm digestion.
But look at how the systemic consequences cascade from that single biological premise. The spice is excreted deep beneath the surface where it interacts with trace subterranean water pockets,
Causing a reaction.
a highly volatile pre-spice mass, culminating in massive, violent explosions on the surface, which they call spice blows. Therefore, the extraction of the universe's most critical resource is intrinsically linked to extreme danger, unpredictable geology, and biological scarcity.
Everything connects.
The geopolitical tension between the great houses, the monopoly of the Spacing Guild, the systemic oppression of the Fremen, it all derives logically from the digestive tract of a single organism.
The source highlights how granular this consistency gets too. The Fremen don't ride these massive worms using telepathy or magic spells. They utilize specific mechanical tools called maker hooks.
Grounded mechanics.
Right, they wedge these hooks under the heavy armor plating of the worm, prying it back to expose the sensitive, soft tissue underneath. The physical irritation prevents the worm from diving back into the abrasive sand, and that localized pain is the steering mechanism. It is a completely grounded mechanical explanation for an incredibly fantastical image.
Furthermore, the pharmacological properties of the spice, the expansion of consciousness, and the mathematical prescience required to navigate folded space directly mirror the historical use of psychoactive compounds in human religious rituals aimed at achieving divine communion.
The architecture is flawless because every localized detail reinforces the structural integrity of the whole.
And to really grasp why this consistency matters, we have to contrast it with communication that lacks it. The source brings up a fascinating comparison between older DC comics, specifically Superman, and the modern Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Let's analyze the physical reality of Superman in those earlier iterations. The narrative frequently requires him to accelerate to supersonic velocities to intercept a human falling from a skyscraper.
Which is a massive physics problem.
Huge. If we apply the baseline atomic units of physics to that scenario, catching a human body at that speed would not save them. The sudden deceleration would be the kinetic equivalent of impacting a steel beam at Mach 2. It would be instantly, graphically fatal.
So how did the writers explain this glaring physical contradiction?
They didn't anchor it in anything logical. They introduced an incredibly lazy concept called an invisible tactile telekinetic aura that supposedly enveloped whoever he touched.
That's terrible writing.
Or when asked why his disguise as Clark Kent worked, they claimed his glasses projected a microscopic hypnotic beam. It feels insulting to the reader because it's intellectually bankrupt. It breaks the immersion immediately.
It violates the established atomic units of the world without providing a structurally sound alternative. You are demanding the audience suspend their disbelief without providing the scaffolding to support that suspension.
It's just lazy.
Contrast this failure with the strategic patience demonstrated by the Marvel Cinematic Universe in establishing the character of Thanos. They did not simply rely on exposition to declare his threat level.
Right. In his first major appearance in Infinity War, he engages the Hulk in hand-to-hand combat.
And he systematically dismantles him. The Hulk represents the established, unquestioned apex of raw physical power within that universe's continuity. By having Thanos physically dominate him with effortless precision, the writers are not just foreshadowing.
They are establishing a law.
An unshakable mathematical law of power scaling for the rest of the narrative. They anchor the stakes inextricably to an event the audience has actually witnessed.
This brings us to a transition that fundamentally shifts how we view the act of writing. Because you can map a target's world perfectly. You can borrow the best historical anchors, and you can build an internally consistent universe like Dune. But all of that architectural brilliance is completely useless if the receiver's brain actively refuses to process the information.
It bounces right off.
Exactly. And this introduces the concept of cognitive hospitality, which completely changes the utility of simplicity. Drop a comment below if you've ever seen this play out in your own corporate environment, where a brilliant idea was rejected just because of how it was presented.
Cognitive hospitality is a critical framework. We must recognize that the human brain is not a passive sponge. It operates with a highly aggressive, localized immune system designed to reject novel ideas.
Why is that the default?
Because the brain is, at its core, a biological engine optimized for caloric conservation. Processing complex, high-dimensional concepts or parsing convoluted, academic syntax requires a massive expenditure of metabolic energy. Consequently, the brain's default evolutionary posture toward complex new information is outright rejection.
So when legendary writing instructors like William Zinsser or Paul Graham aggressively advocate for simplicity, cutting adjectives, using shorter sentences, they aren't doing it to dumb the material down for a less intelligent audience.
Not at all.
They are doing it to bypass the biological immune system. They are practicing cognitive hospitality to ensure the payload is actually delivered.
They are intentionally reducing the required cognitive load to parse the transmission, thereby preserving the reader's caloric energy to absorb the actual substance of the argument. And the source material highlights a highly unsettling psychological phenomenon regarding when this cognitive immune system naturally fails.
This is the part of the deep dive that requires serious reflection. When are individuals statistically most susceptible to adopting obscure, unverified, or fringe beliefs? Whether it's extreme political ideologies, pseudoscientific wellness cults, or radical financial schemes.
It occurs when they are at their absolute lowest point structurally.
Following a profound trauma, a financial collapse, or prolonged emotional exhaustion, that severe depletion of reserves literally powers down the cognitive immune system.
The brain lacks the energy to run the defense protocols, making the individual highly suggestible. It induces a state of critical vulnerability. The source notes that the administration of certain psychedelic compounds replicates this chemically, dropping the boundaries of the established worldview.
But the more relevant discovery discussed by Varun Maya comes from the media sector. They identified a synthetic, highly replicable mechanism for temporarily disabling this immune system without trauma or chemistry.
High-velocity, hyper-optimized video editing.
Exactly. They observed that deploying highly dynamic visual cuts, precise auditory drops, and relentless pacing effectively overloads the brain's processing capacity.
It forcibly overrides the critical faculties, inducing a state of passive, trance-like reception. In this state, the viewer becomes exponentially more suggestible to the underlying narrative. They are synthetically manufacturing the cognitive vulnerability required to install a new worldview.
If the mechanics of hospitality and cognitive load are so well understood, why do so many highly intelligent, highly educated professionals fail at it? I mean, why does corporate communication, academic writing, and policy drafting consistently read like it was designed to maximize friction?
This is a phenomenon cognitive scientist Steven Pinker identifies as the curse of knowledge.
The curse of knowledge?
Yes, it is a profound structural failure of empathy. When you achieve deep expertise in a specific domain, your brain begins to compress and chunk complex information to process it more efficiently. Over time, you literally lose the neurological ability to simulate what it feels like to not possess that foundational knowledge.
You assume everyone knows what you know.
You assume the receiver has access to the same compressed data files you do. The source provides a perfect translation of this from the financial sector. Imagine a highly successful entrepreneur speaking, and they casually mention having 100 crores liquid, which translates to roughly 12 million US dollars in cash.
To the entrepreneur, that is a compressed metric, a simple unit of measurement.
But to the average global listener, that number is so abstract, so vastly disconnected from their daily reality, that the cognitive immune system immediately deflects it. The listener cannot visualize the scale, so they disengage.
But if they change the framing?
If that exact same entrepreneur recalibrates their transmission and says, imagine making just 5 lakhs, around $6,000, the listener immediately leans in. They have a localized anchor for that amount.
The curse of knowledge creates huge blind spots in communication strategy. Consider the trajectory of Zerodha, a massively successful Indian financial services firm. For an extended period, the founders were generating thousands of crores in corporate dividends. The public reaction was completely muted.
Because the concept of corporate dividends exists outside the atomic units of the general public. It is an abstract mechanism of wealth transfer.
Right. However, the moment the media reported that the founders had approved a 100 crore salary, public outrage was instantaneous and overwhelming.
Because the term salary is an atomic unit. Every working-class individual understands the concept of a salary. When you attach an astronomical figure to a localized atomic unit, the brain processes the disparity immediately.
Utilizing simplified language and communicating exclusively within the atomic units of your target demographic is not an insult to their intellectual capacity. It is a profound demonstration of respect for their cognitive operating system.
You are optimizing your software to run flawlessly on their existing hardware, rather than demanding they upgrade their entire neurological infrastructure just to decipher your opening paragraph.
Let's escalate this. If we understand how to bypass the immune system using hospitality, how do we engage in radical persuasion? Suppose you have a mandate to convince a hostile counterpart of a reality that completely contradicts their existing worldview. How do you execute that without resorting to deception?
The framework introduced here is reach from ground truth. The core mathematical challenge of radical persuasion is calculating the exact degree of deviation you can introduce while relying entirely on verifiable, factual statements.
Because what is the amateur approach? The amateur attempts to brute force a paradigm shift. If you are arguing about climate policy or supply chain logistics, the amateur just starts detonating contradictory data points. Look at this graph, look at this peer-reviewed study. Your entire premise is invalid. And what is the biological result?
The target's cognitive immune system triggers a massive inflammatory response. Their psychological defenses harden, and they double down on their original position, regardless of the data quality.
Decks don't work.
Brute force data bombardment is statistically guaranteed to fail in high-stakes negotiations. The master persuader uses a completely different sequence. They start with profound validation.
They initiate by explicitly weaponizing the target's own skepticism. If you are pitching a disruptive enterprise software, you do not start with the feature list. You start by saying, you are entirely justified in treating new tech implementations with extreme prejudice. Historically, 90% of enterprise software is bloated vaporware designed to trap you in a localized ecosystem and extract licensing fees.
You just articulated their deepest fear. You proved you live in their world. The immune system powers down.
You have securely anchored yourself to their ground truth. Only from that secure position do you execute the pivot. And that historical failure rate is precisely why our architecture is entirely open source, allowing you to retain sovereign control of your data layer regardless of our relationship.
You maneuver them sequentially.
Yeah.
But to make that maneuver stick, You have to understand the flaw in how humans calculate reality. We do not calculate probability, we calculate availability.
The availability heuristic. This is the psychological principle that humans judge the likelihood or severity of an event based entirely on how easily they can summon a vivid visual example of it in their mind's eye.
The brain efficiently substitutes ease of neurological recall for statistical probability.
The source uses a brilliant, universally relatable example for this: quicksand.
Oh, this is great.
If you consumed Western media and adventure films in the 1980s and 90s, you were conditioned to believe that quicksand was a primary, localized threat to human life. The visual imagery is highly available: the slow sinking, the panic, the inevitability.
But if you analyze the actual physics, the human body is naturally buoyant in quicksand. You would generally only sink to your waist. The statistical cause of mortality is not drowning, it is exposure or dehydration from being immobilized.
The actual global fatality rate from quicksand is functionally zero.
Yet it occupies a massive space in the collective risk assessment because the imagery bypasses the analytical mind. Conversely, consider the global impact of diarrheal diseases. They are a massive structural cause of mortality, statistically eclipsing shark attacks, airplane failures, and terrorism combined.
However, you cannot greenlight a $90 million Hollywood thriller where the primary antagonist is waterborne bacteria.
It lacks cinematic availability. It doesn't trigger that visceral, localized fear response.
No.
Therefore, if you're attempting to persuade a geopolitical body or a corporate board, you cannot rely on abstract spreadsheets. You must engineer a highly specific, concrete narrative that implants itself in their availability matrix.
But what happens if the target holds a rigid belief that actively blocks your narrative? How do you dismantle a core conviction?
You must structurally engineer cognitive dissonance. You trap the receiver in a localized paradox between two truths they already accept, forcing their own brain to reconcile the contradiction.
The source provides a phenomenal example of this from the tech sector. Let's say your objective is to convince a senior software engineer that media content creation is a more structurally valuable industry than code generation. If you state that thesis directly, they will reject it.
Their atomic unit is engineering creates the infrastructure, content is just the exhaust generated by the users.
Right. So you avoid a direct assault on that premise. You initiate a sequence of targeted inquiries. You ask, if we look at your personal consumption metrics, how many entirely new, discrete software applications have you downloaded and integrated into your daily workflow in the past 12 months? The standard response is generally 1 or 2.
Then you spring the trap. You ask, in that exact same time frame, how many new content creators, analytical channels, or specific media properties have you begun consuming? The number is inevitably in the hundreds.
You have successfully induced dissonance.
You highlight the structural paradox. You say, you are currently extracting value from hundreds of distinct media microenterprises, all of which are hosted on a single legacy application, YouTube, that was architected over a decade ago and requires a relatively stagnant engineering headcount to maintain. The velocity of your media consumption exponentially outpaces the velocity of your software adoption.
You force their analytical mind to observe that their daily behavior fundamentally contradicts their stated ideology, that friction creates a cognitive vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Into that space, you insert your new paradigm.
That is incredibly effective. But there is another common failure point in persuasion, particularly among highly educated professionals. The source defines it as the engineering answer syndrome.
This is the critical error of the comprehensive laundry list. In an academic environment, you are systematically rewarded for demonstrating exhaustive knowledge. If you are presented with a complex problem, you supply 10 contributing factors, operating under the assumption that cumulative volume equates to accuracy.
You think partial credit will be awarded if one point resonates.
But in global markets, in high-stakes capital allocation, partial credit does not exist. You either secure the sovereign wealth funding or you do not. You either close the acquisition or you walk away with 0.
Providing a 10-point argument actually degrades your structural integrity. The human brain, operating defensively, will naturally scan the list, identify the weakest, most easily refutable point, and attack it, thereby collapsing the entire premise.
The master persuader ignores the superficial symptoms and isolates the single highest leverage point, the foundational assumption upon which the entire counter-argument rests.
Let's apply this to the capital structures of digital media, utilizing the example from the source regarding game development. The global assumption is that developing a AAA digital asset, a major video game, requires a localized budget of $100 million. If you walk into a publisher and offer a list of 10 minor operational efficiencies, saving a few thousand on server costs, negotiating better office leases, they will dismiss you.
You aren't changing the math.
You must attack the core architectural assumption of the $100 million figure itself. If you dissect that budget, approximately $75 million is allocated to global marketing and distribution, leaving roughly $25 million for actual software development.
But what dictates that $25 million requirement?
It is primarily the labor cost of Western engineering talent. A senior C++ developer in the United States commands a localized salary of $200,000 annually. However, a developer of exact technical parity in an emerging market like India commands a fraction of that cost.
But it's not just the labor arbitrage. You also have to bring in the technological reality. The source specifically mentions the integration of advanced tool sets like Unreal Engine and massive photogrammetry asset libraries. By utilizing a game engine that handles the foundational physics and rendering, and by purchasing highly realistic photogrammetry assets instead of modeling every single rock and tree from scratch, the actual labor hours required plummet.
Precisely. You combine the geographic labor arbitrage with the technological acceleration of Unreal Engine. In a single concentrated argument, you annihilate the core assumption.
You don't give them a list of 10 things.
You demonstrate that the fundamental constraint on digital development is no longer the complexity of the code, but the inefficiency of Western labor models combined with outdated proprietary tech stacks. By leveraging Indian engineering parity and off-the-shelf photogrammetry, the development budget collapses from $25 million to $2.5 million. You do not need 9 supporting arguments. That one structural reality entirely shatters their localized worldview.
The source provides a second example of the highest leverage point that is rooted purely in executive psychology. Varun Maya details the process of hiring a highly compensated chief financial officer for his scaling enterprise. He asks the executive recruiter, provide the justification for paying this massive premium for this specific individual over a competent standard accountant.
An amateur recruiter would have deployed the laundry list. They would have recited the resume. He possesses an MBA from a Tier 1 institution. He has localized expertise in international tax structures. He successfully managed the ledger at these 3 legacy corporations.
But the recruiter understood the exact psychological state of a founder operating a rapidly scaling entity with hundreds of employees. He understood the highest leverage point wasn't technical competence, it was neurological relief. The recruiter offered a single sentence. If you hire him, he will let you close your eyes and go faster.
It is a devastatingly precise psychological payload. It entirely bypasses the localized technical requirements of the role and strikes directly at the founder's most agonizing structural vulnerability.
The need for trust.
The desperate, suffocating need for absolute operational trust, which is the only mechanism that allows a leader to focus on external scale rather than internal crisis management. That single sentence provided total resolution to the founder's internal dissonance.
We have just journeyed through a massive architectural framework. We have dissected the predatory psychology of cold outreach, the rigid mathematics of venture capital, the biological consistency required to build a fictional universe, the vulnerabilities of the brain's immune system, and the aggressive mechanics of radical persuasion.
It's a lot to process.
If you have been analyzing this carefully, you might assume we have just concluded a masterclass in human-to-human communication. But here is where the entire foundation of this deep dive shifts, because the source material executes a profound bait and switch.
This is the critical transition. Every single structural concept we have rigorously defined. The mapping of atomic units, the establishment of cognitive anchors, the necessity of deep localized lore, the induction of dissonance, the precise constraint of attention, is not simply a framework for manipulating human psychology.
What is it then?
It is the exact, literal, mathematical blueprint required to command and program artificial intelligence.
That is the twist that redefines everything. Effective prompting, the way you interact with Claude, ChatGPT, or any frontier large language model, is not coding. It is literally, mathematically, world building.
We must elevate the technical analysis here to understand why this is true. A large language model, in its raw, unprompted baseline state, is not a sentient entity waiting to answer your question. It is a vast, high-dimensional probability space. It represents pure, chaotic, infinite mathematical potential. The vocabulary of the model is not stored like words in a dictionary. It is represented by what are called token embeddings.
I think a lot of people picture AI accessing a massive digital library and pulling books off a shelf. But that's the wrong analogy, isn't it? A library implies discrete, organized categories.
Yes, a library is far too static an analogy. You must conceptualize a universe containing tens of thousands of spatial dimensions. Within this multidimensional vacuum, every single concept, every word, every fragment of human syntax is assigned a specific, localized coordinate, a vector. The physical laws governing this universe dictate that concepts with similar semantic meanings are positioned mathematically close to one another.
So in this space, the mathematical vector for the concept of gang signs is physically located much closer to the vectors for hood or street corner than it is to the vector for corporate boardroom. It is a literal spatial map of human meaning generated by analyzing the entirety of our digitized history.
Exactly. And when you initiate a new session, when you open that blank prompt interface, the AI is suspended in the exact center of that infinite probability space. It has no localized reality. Your prompt functions as the introduction of gravitational force.
So you give it a lazy prompt.
If you input a lazy generic prompt like "write me a story," you are applying almost zero specific gravity. You leave the model drifting in a broad, undefined region of the embedding space. The output it generates will be the most mathematically average, predictable, generic sequence of tokens possible.
But what happens when you apply the rigid principles of world building we discussed with Dune? What if you input, write a narrative set in 2049 cyberpunk Mumbai, where the protagonist is a mute corporate espionage agent who only communicates using encrypted gang signs?
You have just executed a mathematical teleportation. You instantly collapse the infinite probability space and violently drag the model's localized attention to a highly specific, tightly constrained coordinate within that multidimensional universe. You've established the atomic units of a temporary reality. And this is where the core physics of the model activate, specifically through a process known as contextual modulation.
Let's break down contextual modulation. How does that actually change the output of the model?
It dictates that tokens, words, do not possess static meaning. Their localized definition is warped by the gravitational pull of the words immediately surrounding them. When you engineer a dense prompt filled with highly specific entities, strict logical rules, and atmospheric constraints, you are generating a localized contextual field.
A gravity well.
Yes. This field physically bends the mathematical space around the model. It reconfigures the probability distribution so that the specific, nuanced concepts you require become statistically inevitable, and the generic, unwanted cliches become mathematically impossible to generate.
And the engine driving all of this is the attention mechanism.
The transformer architecture, which is the foundational technology of every modern LLM, is entirely reliant on the attention mechanism. You can conceptualize it as a highly focused, highly localized spotlight scanning across billions of parameters. When you provide a detailed world-building prompt, you are explicitly programming that spotlight, telling it exactly which vectors to illuminate and which to ignore.
And if you don't?
If you fail to provide the deep lore, if you fail to provide the maker hooks to steer the sandworm, the spotlight wanders erratically, illuminating only the most heavily worn generic pathways in the neural network.
This perfectly mirrors the strategy of anchoring your arguments with concrete examples, like pointing to Physics Wallow or Mr. Beast in a VC pitch. In AI engineering, this translates directly to few-shot prompting. That is the technique where you provide the model with 3 or 4 highly specific examples of the exact output format you want before you give it the actual task.
Few-shot prompting is the computational equivalent of grounding a theoretical frame shift. When you feed the AI precise examples of the required tone, the specific logical deductions it should make, and the exact formatting it must output, you are forcibly uploading the deep lore of your universe.
You are writing the physical laws of the reality it now inhabits.
You can even institute negative physical laws. You can command, under no circumstances may you utilize standard corporate jargon. You are forbidden from utilizing explanatory negations, such as "we are not just doing X."
You are literally establishing the localized boundaries of reality. The source material frames this with a profound metaphor. When you possess access to a frontier language model, you are functionally playing God. You have the capacity to spawn infinite, highly constrained universes on demand.
And it is a catastrophic waste of leverage to possess the power to engineer a universe, only to input a lazy 3-sentence prompt that generates generic corporate sludge.
You must extend cognitive hospitality to the machine in the exact same manner you extend it to a human target. You must architect a localized reality that is mathematically effortless for its attention mechanism to navigate. Writing is the act of organized thinking, and advanced prompting is simply writing the laws of physics for a temporary digital consciousness.
It really is.
Let us synthesize this entire geopolitical and psychological architecture. If you're finding value in this level of structural breakdown, hit the like button. It helps us keep doing these deep dives. What we have uncovered today is a unified theory of influence. Whether you are Samperik attempting to hijack the specific confirmation bias of a stressed founder to secure capital, whether you are an entrepreneur trying to forcibly shift the rigid mathematical worldview of an institutional investor,
Or Frank Herbert, meticulously engineering the biological dependency of the spice melange to anchor an interstellar epic.
or whether you are a systems engineer carefully manipulating the high-dimensional vector space of a trillion-parameter neural network, the operational mechanics are completely identical.
It is all applied structural psychology. It is the deliberate, calculated construction of a temporary, localized reality. It requires absolute respect for the physical and biological constraints of the system you are attempting to interface with.
Whether that system is the fragile, calorically constrained human brain or the vast, chaotic probability space of an AI model.
You are never merely expressing your internal state. You are surgically guiding the attention, the localized reality, and the ultimate conviction of your target.
It is an absolute superpower in the modern economy, but it is a capability that forces a very dark, very uncomfortable realization about our own autonomy.
The implications are severe. I want everyone listening to rigorously analyze this final structural question. If we now possess empirical proof that both advanced artificial intelligence models and human biological networks navigate reality based entirely on the external prompts, the foundational atomic units, and the localized world building they are subjected to.
How much of your own core identity is actually yours?
That is the ultimate vulnerability. Interrogate your deepest political convictions, your localized economic anxieties, your specific, highly personal definition of success. How much of that internal architecture is the result of your own independent, sovereign, objective analysis? And how much of it is simply the delayed execution of an incredibly sophisticated, highly targeted prompt? A localized worldview engineered by a master communicator, a global algorithm, or a political entity that was quietly installed in your brain years ago, entirely bypassing your cognitive immune system while your attention was diverted elsewhere.
Are you the sovereign author of your localized reality, or are you simply rendering someone else's code? That is the structural tension you must navigate going forward. Thank you for joining us on this extensive analysis. Take these frameworks, apply them to your strategic communications, utilize them to constrain the models you work with, but above all, use them to aggressively audit and defend the architecture of your own mind. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, and we will see you next time on The Deep Dive.